One common kind of inductive argument that you will encounter frequently, especially in philosophical discussions, is known as an argument by analogy. In this module, we're going to turn our attention to a closer examination of what exactly an argument by analogy is, and in doing so, we'll discuss one of the most famous examples of all time, William Paley's design argument for God's existence. I wanted to address a special kind of inductive argument because you run into them, and in fact, we will encounter this exact argument later in the semester, the one at the bottom here, arguably the most famous argument by analogy, maybe not just in philosophy, but maybe ever and generally. We're going to actually get acquainted with it in much more detail later in the semester. But anyway, argument by analogy or argument from analogy, you've probably heard that maybe. You've heard of that term or that phrase. So I want to take a little bit of time because, again, you do encounter these in philosophy fairly frequently, I would say. So what are arguments by analogy or arguments from analogy? Again, this is a type of inductive argument, okay? And the way it works is in an argument by analogy, whoever's offering the argument, right, they're comparing two things. So if we were in Philosophy 103, we would elaborate on this in much more detail. And so we would introduce a lot of terminology. So for example, these are known as analogs. The two things you're comparing, whether they're people, objects, whatever they are, classes, whatever's being compared, right, are called the analogs, okay? So in this case, I've given you just an example here, okay? So Susie and Sally are two sisters. And the way it works is the person offering the argument, right, references and cites all these known similarities. So for example, we know that Susie and Sally both like Philosophy 203. They both like the color blue. That's why there's these check marks, okay? We know that's the case, okay? We know they both like scary movies. Now the question is, right, are they going to like Philosophy 100, okay? So we know Susie does, and the way this argument works is the person offering this argument is going to say, therefore, it's likely that Sally will as well. So their conclusion is, if these were outlined in, up here, right? The first premise might be rattling off all these similarities. We know Susie and Sally both like Philosophy 203, color blue, and scary movies. Premise 2 would be something like, we know also that Susie likes Philosophy 100. And so then they, based on this other known similarities, they want to suggest that it's likely then that Sally is also going to like Philosophy 100. You guys see how that works? Okay, and there's something to this. The more known similarities that are present between two things, the more likely they are to be similar in other respects. Now, what are some issues here? Like, how could we attack the analogy? You might rattle off, well, here's a few ways, okay? You might rattle off 7 million similarities, but be like, well, hold up, dude, none of those are actually connect to this. So they're not relevant. What does it matter if they have 10,000 similarities, but none of the similarities are relevant to, we call this in Philosophy 103, the feature or the attribute of interest. The thing we know is true of one analog and are trying to suggest is true of the other, okay? How relevant are those known similarities to the feature or attribute of interest? They have to be kind of relevant, otherwise what's the point in illuminating these similarities, right? So one way you can attack the analogy is to point out all the things that are suggested to be similar, they don't have any bearing or relevance to the feature or attribute of interest. Now in this case, like Philosophy 203 probably does have some relevance, right? But maybe you might make the case that liking the color blue and scary movies has very little, if any, bearing on whether someone's going to like Philosophy 100, okay? Or another way to attack the analogy, try to undermine an argument from analogy that somebody's offered, is to say, yeah, you pointed out 3 similarities, but what about the 18,000 known dissimilarities, right? We know that Susie hates the color green, while that's Sally's favorite, right? We know Susie loves their mom, but Sally hates her, or whatever, right? So you could point out all these other known dissimilarities, rather. And then the most damning way that you can undermine someone's argument from analogy is to provide or introduce what are known as contrary analogs. Okay, so what's a contrary analog? In this case, it's going to be a third sister here, Sarah. A contrary analog is, in this case, a sister that we know has all the known similarities as well, but then we know definitively does not have the feature or attribute of interest. The more contrary analogs you can provide to someone's argument by analogy, the less and less credible their argument from analogy is, because you're basically saying, look, all those things you are suggesting will make this likely. We know that's not always the case, right? And the more of these examples you provide, the more that becomes obvious. Does that make sense? So this is the easiest way to try to undermine. I mean, if you can find a contrary analog, that provides the most, what's the word, like the strongest counter to someone's argument from analogy. Okay. Does that make sense? So argument from analogy or argument by analogy is a type of inductive argument. Okay. Now, let's apply it or like see it in this case of William Paley. So this is, again, a real, so to speak, argument from analogy that was offered back at the end of, as I say up there, at the end of the 18th century. We're going to see Paley and him offering this argument from analogy, but then we're also going to see kind of what David Hume has to say about the same sort of argument. But anyway, have you guys heard of this, the watchmaker argument for God's existence? Exactly. So Paley says there's something about the watch versus a rock. If we just were walking in nature and we stumbled upon a watch, right? There's something about it that's definitively different from the rock. Right? The rock, we could imagine, he says, was just there since the beginning of time. He says we can't think the same way about the watch because of, how do you put it, so finely tuned, right? Everything had to be just right. You had to have the exact materials, finely tuned in just the right way, right? And if certain parts weren't in certain places, then, or if anything was just off a little bit, it wouldn't work, right? So he says all of this, the intricacies of the functionality and so on, seem to indicate a purpose and a design. Ergo, somebody created it and made it this way. Right? Versus a rock could have just been that way naturally since the beginning of time, he says. Okay, so at least that's kind of his initial suggestion, right? There's something about this watch that gets us to infer then it's not just like a rock. Somebody had to make it this way. And so it's suggesting, right, its design and its functionality and how everything had to be just right, suggests then that there was this intelligent designer, the watchmaker, who made it. Well, he says, hey, you know what else is really complex and seems to work in a very similar way, except magnified 100-fold, 100 billion-fold, is the universe. I mean, take exactly what we said about the watch and apply it to life on Earth. If everything has to be just right and situated just right. If anything was off just a little bit, right, we wouldn't have life on Earth. Okay, so again, the same thing that we infer from the watch, he says we should be inferring from the universe. So what's his conclusion here? God exists, right? There is an intelligent designer for the universe as well then. Okay. Okay, so pretty famous argument by analogy that we will, again, read ourselves later in the semester. Understanding how arguments, including an argument by analogy, works puts us in a better position to see when an argument fails. In the next module, we'll turn our attention to fallacies or mistakes in reasoning.